This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is flyer number 381, entitled Big Historical Shifts: The Pill, Feminism, Masculism. Description. This flyer claims that the rise of masculism will prove to be as important a historical shift as was feminism, and something that future historians will write chapters about in their history books. Now, the flyer itself. Big Historical Shifts: The Pill, Feminism, Masculism, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. A lot of people have probably noticed how feministed movies have become over the past few years, with frail 20-year-old females single-handedly wiping out whole gangs of males with women's jiu-jitsu and muscle power. This farce can be explained in terms of market forces, namely that the majority of moviegoers are now female, so that the producers of movies have to cater to their female audiences, so have to appeal to the whims of women, that is, their desire to feel powerful, to be able to conquer men, even if the laws of physics have to be broken by pretending that men do not have 3 times greater strength across the chest than women. It took half a century for feminism to move from the intellectuals crying in the wilderness stage in the late 60s to the mainstream stage of today, that is so influential with the general female public that it features in today's movies. In other words, feminism has had a profound influence on women and therefore on society as a whole. One wonders how long it will take for masculism to achieve a similar level of success. Will it also take half a century as feminism did, that is, from the time I was a young man in his 20s, participating in the first major feminist demo in London in the early 70s, to watching now feminist movies for the masses? ? Masculism is now where feminism was in the late 60s, that is, in the intellectuals crying in the wilderness phase. So, there's something missing here in the essay. So, it may be years or even decades. So we may be years or even decades away from seeing masculism become mainstream. So one can ask, just how influential will masculism become in the coming years? I think masculism will become incredibly powerful in the coming decade, having as much an impact, if not more, on society than is feminism. The 2020s will be the decade of masculism. It will be men's turn to dominate gender politics after women have been dominating this field for half a century. This flyer/video has as its major aim to convince you of this. I see the rise of feminism as a natural consequence of the male invention of the pill, that is, the contraceptive pill, which effectively liberated women from undesired pregnancy. Women could reliably control the number of kids they wanted, and since it costs about $250,000 to raise a kid in the US today, women have been choosing to have 0, 1 or 2 kids in most cases. It was men who liberated women from household drudgery by giving women the pill, household gadgets, that is, the electrical revolution, modern medicine, female life expectancies well into the 80s, higher education, etc. So that in practice, even for those women who have their 2 kids, they still have half a century career window, which is the primary reason for the meteoric rise of modern feminism. In the 60s, women were housewives, living the traditional female role of being the child raiser, the Hausfrau, the cook, the house cleaner, the household shopper, etc. With 2 small kids, this was a full-time job, but once the kids were off to kindergarten or to school, these university-educated, upper-middle-class housewives got bored. They felt their lives were in limbo, purposeless, depressing, so they rebelled and advocated that women take up careers like men, preaching to women that anything a man can do, a woman can do, and women are the equal of men, so should be given equal rights with men, equal opportunities with men, the right to terminate an unwanted pregnancy, half the positions of power in politics and in the boardroom, running countries and companies, that is real female power. Thus one can say that the male invention of the pill, together with the non-negligible contributions from the other things listed above, was the enabling factor that got feminism off the ground. In my view, the contraceptive pill is the greatest social revolution of all time. It has had a profound impact on women's lives, allowing them to transform themselves away from being full-time baby factories and child raisers, often having a dozen kids, half of whom died young, to becoming female careerists like men, earning real money like men, taking positions of influence and power like men, and acquiring real status like men. The rise of feminism I see as one of the most significant social changes in history, a big historical shift, as in the title of this flyer, that the historians will be writing about forever as one of the major social changes that occurred in the second half of the 20th century and beyond. But what about masculism? Why do I think that masculism will also be of comparable social influence? What impact will masculism have on society? And why do I think that this impact will be so strong that future historians will write about it as being as significant as feminism, if not more so? There is a reason for the above title of this flyer. I see the pill as the main cause of feminism, and I see feminism as the main cause of masculism. The pill enabled, in capital letters, feminism, and as I see it, feminism enabled, in capital letters, masculism. In the sense that, as masculists say, now that women can work, they must work. Anything else is manslavery, and manslavery will eventually get women killed. Traditionally, men paid a very heavy price to get regular sex from a woman, that is, to be her manslave, to work for her, so that she could stay at home raising the next generation, that is, usually a whole brood of kids, which rising health standards and more effective science-based medicine kept alive with greater frequency. My own mother had 11 other siblings. She was born only a century ago. The traditional gender roles of the father of the nuclear family being the breadwinner and the mother being the baby factory and child raiser made sense a century or more ago, because being a housewife and child raiser was a full-time job before there were household gadgets and the pill. It was simply not practical for most women to be full-time careerists the way men were, and to be full-time mothers at the same time. If the mother was out the door for half the day pursuing a career, and so was the husband, then who looked after the kids while the mother was working outside the house? It just wasn't practical. So after the Industrial Revolution and the factory system was set up, the traditional gender roles became firmly entrenched. They simply made sense. They were practical. But with the male invention of the contraceptive pill in the 60s, that changed everything. Women could reliably decide on how many kids they wanted, and they chose to have far fewer. That meant a lot more free time for women during their lifetimes. I remember when I was postdocing and researching in Japan in the 90s that the Jap husbands overworked as salarymen and the Jap wives played tennis, having a great time with their female friends while their man-slaved husbands died from karoshi, that is, death from overwork. Then the feminists, once they had become politically powerful, took over the divorce courts, and with their new female gender roles given to them by the feminist intellectuals, that's sages, they streamed into the workforce and gained financial independence in large numbers. However, this was before the rise of masculism, so these freshly minted feminists knew nothing about masculist ideas, so by default kept their traditional female expectations of men, that is, seeing men as
existing on this earth to pay for women to have babies.
Millions of women saw other women become FIPs, that's financially independent persons, who were able to divorce their husbands and still survive financially due to their own female careers and incomes. The feminists took over the divorce courts and pushed the politicians to give them what the feminists wanted, that is, to give women the right to divorce on demand, and not for the traditional guilty party type divorce, but simply because these women felt that their marriages had failed and wanted to get out of them. But millions of these women had not bothered to FIP up, that is, become FIPs, by bothering to get a career-competent education, so they could become effective FIPs as adults, the way the masculists wanted women to become. So, when millions of non-FIP, that is, fluffy women, influenced by feminist ideas, divorced, they were still poor, incapable of earning good money, because they had not bothered to become FIPs. Fortunately for them, the feminists had taken over the divorce courts, and since these feminists were what the masculists call monoconscious, that is, only knew feminist ideas and knew nothing about masculist ideas, these feminists continued to view men as
cash machines, placed on this earth to pay for women to have babies.
Divorce courts then became slaughterhouses for men. They would lose custody of their kids with a probability of about 90%, that is, a near certainty. Marriages failed at a rate of about 1 in 2, and in about half of those divorce cases, the ex-wife turned into a vindictive feminazi bitch, out to financially destroy her ex-husband by committing the following massive gender crimes against him. She would have his kids ripped away from him with a 90% probability. She would take his house so that she could raise her kids in it. She would take half his possessions. She would be given child support from him and only allow him to visit his kids twice a month on weekends. And often, if the ex-wife was a real fluffy, that is, a traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite off the money of a man, who did not bother to FIP up at high school and college by getting a career-competent education to become a FIP as an adult, she could force him to pay her alimony for the rest of her life, with no legal nor moral obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and FIP up. Of course, these divorced fathers started screaming out against the massive gender injustices committed against them, created by the fluffy feminists who took over the divorce courts, with all the fluffy feminist hypocrisy that implied. A men's movement was born. That is, the Masculists and the MGTOWs, that's men going their own way, who saw marriage as so toxic for men that they preferred not to marry, not to have kids, and spend their money on themselves. The Masculists were a lot more aggressive than the politically passive MGTOWs, who simply walked away passively from marriage and paternity, whereas Masculists fight. Masculists are verbally and intellectually aggressive, who attack fluffies for their manslavery and fluffy feminists for their hypocrisy, who want equal rights for women in the parliaments but reject equal obligations for women by not sharing the burden of earning the living with men, by not bothering to FIP up. These hated fluffy feminist hypocrites want their cake and to eat it too. The Masculists point out that the greatest sexual discrimination that exists is not committed against women, but against men, in the form of the lack of the para, that's paternity rejection right. whereas women have the MARA, maternity rejection right, so that a woman can reject an unwanted pregnancy, but a man can't. So that a woman can lie to her boyfriend/husband about taking the pill, get pregnant, and then force him to pay for a kid he does not want, thus manslaving him for decades. This is the end of part 1.